What if I told you that one of the most advanced urban civilizations in human history never built grand palaces, towering monuments, or statues of kings to proclaim its power? There were no pyramids piercing the sky, no colossal temples demanding worship, no royal tombs meant to eternalize a ruler's name. And yet, astonishingly, their cities worked quietly, efficiently, and with a level of precision that many modern cities still struggle to achieve. 4,500 years ago, when most of the ancient world revolved around kings, gods, and conquest, this civilization made a radically different choice. They did not build cities to glorify rulers, nor did they design spaces meant to intimidate their people. They did not carve history into stone to announce dominance or divine authority. Instead, they built something far more subtle, and far more dangerous to forget. They built systems. These were cities where daily life flowed with remarkable order, where waste did not choke the streets, where homes, large and small alike, were connected to carefully planned infrastructure. In these cities, order was not enforced by soldiers or royal decrees. It was embedded directly into the design of the city itself. The streets guided behavior. The layout shaped movement. The architecture quietly disciplined daily life without ever issuing a command. And here lies the strangest part of all. For decades, archaeologists have dug through layers of baked brick and ancient soil, expecting to uncover the usual symbols of power: royal palaces, centralized administrative halls, inscriptions praising kings and gods. But they found none. There was no obvious ruling class, no monumental throne rooms, no propaganda carved into stone to announce who was in charge. Yet despite this apparent absence of authority, the cities were astonishingly standardized across vast distances. Brick proportions followed the same ratios. Streets followed the same logic. Urban layouts repeated again and again, from Mohenjo-Daro to Harappa, from Dholavira to Lodhal, stretching across thousands of kilometers. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental, as if someone, or something, was guiding the design with unwavering intent. This raises unsettling questions. If there were no kings, who decided the plan? If there were no monuments, what held society together? And if there was no visible central authority, how did such order survive not for decades, but for centuries? History often tells us a familiar story: civilizations rise through power, hierarchy, and control, through armies, rulers, and fear. But this civilization challenges that story at its core. Here, order appears to come not from force, but from design. The streets themselves guide movement, the layout itself shapes behavior, and the city itself teaches discipline without ever raising its voice. It is as if the builders of this civilization understood something deeply uncomfortable for us to admit even today: when systems are designed intelligently, people do not need to be controlled. And that idea may be the most radical legacy they left behind. For centuries, this civilization thrived. It traded across vast distances, maintained cities that were remarkably clean and resilient, and sustained an urban lifestyle that worked quietly in the background of daily life. And then, without dramatic destruction or final proclamations, it vanished. There is no clear record of conquest, no final inscription explaining what went wrong. Only silent cities, abandoned but not destroyed. With them disappeared a way of thinking about cities that humanity would largely forget, until modern archaeology began uncovering the truth buried beneath the soil. What we are about to explore is not just how the Indus Valley Civilization built its cities, but why they built them the way they did. Because once you understand their logic, one unsettling question remains: did we truly surpass them, or did we simply choose a different path? When archaeologists first began excavating the ruins of the Indus Valley Civilization in the early 20th century, they arrived with assumptions shaped by Egypt and Mesopotamia. They expected to find palaces rising above the cityscape, grand temples dominating the skyline, and clear signs of rulers whose names and authority were etched into stone. They expected monuments that spoke loudly of power. What they found instead was something profoundly different. Street after street appeared in careful order, intersecting at near-perfect right angles. Residential blocks were organized with striking precision, and homes followed consistent architectural principles. Beneath these houses lay infrastructure that suggested planning on a scale far beyond a single ruler's lifetime. And yet, amid all this organization, there was no palace, no royal complex, and no unmistakable seat of centralized power. This absence was not a failure of archaeology. It was a message. In most ancient civilizations, cities grew outward from power. The palace or temple came first, and everything else existed in its shadow. Urban space reflected hierarchy, where proximity to power determined status. The Indus Valley reversed this logic entirely. Here, the city itself appears to have come first. The planning reveals a society that prioritized function over display and efficiency over spectacle. Instead of concentrating resources into monuments meant to glorify elites, intelligence was distributed across the entire urban layout. Neighborhoods mattered as much as city centers. Streets were designed with purpose. Houses were not isolated structures, but components of a larger, integrated system. This suggests something extraordinary. Political authority, if it existed at all, was not the organizing principle of the city. Movement, sanitation, trade, water management, and communal order shaped the urban landscape far more than ideology or royal ambition. Rather than imposing control from above, the Indus Valley Civilization embedded order into the foundation of everyday existence. And that decision, to build cities before kings, may explain both their long-term success and the quiet way their story faded from history. Because systems do not demand remembrance the way monuments do. When the great cities of the Indus Valley thinned and emptied, they did not vanish overnight. There was no final day, no dramatic ending. Instead, urban life slowly unraveled, leaving behind something quieter, but deeply significant. The civilization did not collapse into chaos. It dispersed. People carried knowledge with them as they moved away from monumental cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Skills shaped by centuries of urban living did not disappear, they transformed to fit smaller, more flexible settlements. What was lost was not intelligence, but scale. Large, centrally organized cities demand constant coordination. They rely on standardized materials, shared maintenance systems, and collective responsibility. Once populations spread out, such coordination became unnecessary, and eventually impossible. Without dense cities, the great drainage systems had no purpose. Covered sewers, brick-lined channels, and standardized waste removal only function when thousands of people live in close proximity. In rural or semi-urban settings, simpler solutions suffice. Open drains, pits, and natural absorption replaced complex engineering. This shift marks a critical moment. The Indus Valley's most extraordinary achievement, urban sanitation, was not forgotten because it was inferior, but because the conditions that required it no longer existed. Advanced systems fade quickly when society no longer depends on them. Yet traces of continuity remain. Pottery styles persist. Agricultural practices adapt rather than disappear. Certain construction techniques survive in modified forms. Even concepts of cleanliness and spatial planning echo faintly in later cultures of the subcontinent, though stripped of their original scale and precision. What did not survive was writing. The undeciphered Indus script disappears entirely after urban life dissolves. This suggests that literacy, like drainage, was tied to administration, trade, and city-based governance. Once those structures vanished, writing had no immediate function. The loss of writing is one of history's most profound silences. Without texts, memory becomes fragile. Knowledge must be passed orally, and over generations, complex systems are simplified, then forgotten. Engineering principles that once governed entire cities shrink into local customs and practical habits. Centuries pass. Rivers shift again. Settlements rise and fall. New cultures emerge, unaware that beneath their feet lie streets once cleaner and more organized than many modern cities thousands of years later. When later civilizations develop urban centers in South Asia, they do so without knowledge of the Indus blueprint. Drainage systems are reinvented slowly, unevenly, often less effectively. This is not because later societies lacked ability. It is because technological memory was broken. The Indus Valley stands as a rare example of progress that did not linearly evolve forward. Instead, it surged ahead, reached remarkable heights, and then dissolved, leaving behind lessons that would not be relearned for millennia. Yet archaeology restores part of what was lost. Brick by brick, drain by drain, excavations reveal a civilization obsessed with order, hygiene, and functionality. A society that prioritized collective well-being over monumentality. One that invested more effort in sewage than in palaces. That choice alone separates the Indus Valley from nearly every other ancient civilization. Today, its legacy speaks quietly but powerfully. In an age struggling with urban waste, water management, and sustainable planning, the Indus Valley offers an uncomfortable truth: advanced solutions are not always the result of modern technology, but of thoughtful design and societal priorities. The cities are gone. The drains are silent. But the ideas behind them remain, waiting to be understood, remembered, and perhaps, finally, respected. When the great cities of the Indus Valley thinned and emptied, they did not vanish overnight. There was no final day, no dramatic ending. Instead, urban life slowly unraveled, leaving behind something quieter, but deeply significant. The civilization did not collapse into chaos. It dispersed. People carried knowledge with them as they moved away from monumental cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Skills shaped by centuries of urban living did not disappear, they transformed to fit smaller, more flexible settlements. What was lost was not intelligence, but scale. Large, centrally organized cities demand constant coordination. They rely on standardized materials, shared maintenance systems, and collective responsibility. Once populations spread out, such coordination became unnecessary, and eventually impossible. Without dense cities, the great drainage systems had no purpose. Covered sewers, brick-lined channels, and standardized waste removal only function when thousands of people live in close proximity. In rural or semi-urban settings, simpler solutions suffice. Open drains, pits, and natural absorption replaced complex engineering. This shift marks a critical moment. The Indus Valley's most extraordinary achievement, urban sanitation, was not forgotten because it was inferior, but because the conditions that required it no longer existed. Advanced systems fade quickly when society no longer depends on them. Yet traces of continuity remain. Pottery styles persist. Agricultural practices adapt rather than disappear. Certain construction techniques survive in modified forms. Even concepts of cleanliness and spatial planning echo faintly in later cultures of the subcontinent, though stripped of their original scale and precision. What did not survive was writing. The undeciphered Indus script disappears entirely after urban life dissolves. This suggests that literacy, like drainage, was tied to administration, trade, and city-based governance. Once those structures vanished, writing had no immediate function. The loss of writing is one of history's most profound silences. Without texts, memory becomes fragile. Knowledge must be passed orally, and over generations, complex systems are simplified, then forgotten. Engineering principles that once governed entire cities shrink into local customs and practical habits. Centuries pass. Rivers shift again. Settlements rise and fall. New cultures emerge, unaware that beneath their feet lie streets once cleaner and more organized than many modern cities thousands of years later. When later civilizations develop urban centers in South Asia, they do so without knowledge of the Indus blueprint. Drainage systems are reinvented slowly, unevenly, often less effectively. This is not because later societies lacked ability. It is because technological memory was broken. The Indus Valley stands as a rare example of progress that did not linearly evolve forward. Instead, it surged ahead, reached remarkable heights, and then dissolved, leaving behind lessons that would not be relearned for millennia. Yet archaeology restores part of what was lost. Brick by brick, drain by drain, excavations reveal a civilization obsessed with order, hygiene, and functionality. A society that prioritized collective well-being over monumentality. One that invested more effort in sewage than in palaces. That choice alone separates the Indus Valley from nearly every other ancient civilization. Today, its legacy speaks quietly but powerfully. In an age struggling with urban waste, water management, and sustainable planning, the Indus Valley offers an uncomfortable truth: advanced solutions are not always the result of modern technology, but of thoughtful design and societal priorities. The cities are gone. The drains are silent. But the ideas behind them remain, waiting to be understood, remembered, and perhaps, finally, respected. To truly understand what made the Indus Valley civilization extraordinary, we must stop thinking of their cities as collections of buildings and start seeing them as something far more ambitious: machines. Not machines of iron and gears, but machines of space, flow, and human behavior. Every street, every wall, every drain was part of a larger mechanism designed to keep the city functioning smoothly, quietly, and predictably. Unlike many ancient cities that grew organically, expanding chaotically as populations increased, the cities of the Indus Valley reveal deliberate planning from the very beginning. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, and other major urban centers were not accidental settlements that slowly organized themselves over time. They were planned environments, designed with foresight and intention before the first bricks were laid. The streets followed a clear grid system, running north to south and east to west, intersecting at consistent angles. This was not merely aesthetic order. Grid planning allowed for controlled movement of people, goods, water, and waste. It ensured that air could circulate, that sunlight reached homes, and that congestion was minimized. In effect, the city regulated itself. But what is most remarkable is that this planning did not privilege elites. In many ancient civilizations, urban order diminished the farther one moved from the palace or temple. In the Indus Valley, order extended everywhere. Even modest homes followed consistent construction standards, often built with baked bricks of uniform proportions. This standardization was not symbolic, it was practical. Uniform bricks meant faster construction, easier repairs, and structural reliability across generations. The cities were often divided into distinct zones, usually a raised citadel area and a lower residential city. For a long time, archaeologists assumed the citadel must have housed rulers or priests. Yet excavations revealed no lavish palaces, no royal tombs, no evidence of a ruling elite living above the rest. Instead, these elevated areas often contained public infrastructure, granaries, large bathing complexes, assembly spaces, and storage facilities. This suggests that elevation was not about power, it was about function. Critical facilities were raised to protect them from flooding, to keep them accessible during seasonal changes, and to ensure long-term durability. Once again, practicality replaced spectacle. Homes themselves were designed with an understanding of privacy, ventilation, and sanitation that feels startlingly modern. Many houses were inward-facing, built around central courtyards rather than opening directly onto the street. This design moderated temperature, provided light, and created private family spaces while still integrating each household into the larger urban system. But perhaps the most telling sign that these cities were engineered systems lies beneath the streets, hidden from view. While most ancient civilizations treated waste as an afterthought, something to be discarded wherever possible, the Indus Valley treated it as a central design challenge. Waste had to move, water had to flow, and the city had to remain livable over decades and centuries. This is where the city machine truly reveals itself. Every major street contained covered drains constructed from precisely fitted bricks. These drains were not crude channels, they were engineered conduits with gradients that ensured consistent flow. They included inspection points and removable covers, allowing for maintenance and cleaning. Household drains connected to these larger systems, creating a network that carried wastewater safely away from living spaces. Such a system could not function without regulation, coordination, and shared standards. It required not just technical knowledge, but social cooperation. Households had to build according to rules. Streets had to remain unobstructed. Maintenance had to be routine. In other words, the city demanded discipline, but not enforced by soldiers or kings. The discipline was architectural. This raises a profound question. How does a society maintain such coordination without visible authority? The answer may lie in the very nature of the city itself. When infrastructure is well designed, compliance becomes effortless. When systems work, people follow them naturally. The city guides behavior without coercion. In the Indus Valley, the machine did not dominate the people, it served them. And in doing so, it shaped a civilization that functioned with remarkable stability. Yet no machine runs forever. The same systems that sustain these cities also make their disappearance more puzzling. There is little evidence of violent destruction, no widespread signs of invasion or catastrophic collapse. The machine did not break suddenly. It slowed. It changed. And eventually, it stopped. To understand why, we must look closer, deeper, into the most sophisticated component of this ancient urban machine. A system so advanced that water gives life to civilizations, but it can also destroy them. Floods, contamination, and stagnation have ended cities far more effectively than armies ever could. What makes the Indus Valley Civilization extraordinary is not that it lived beside rivers, but that it mastered water in ways that most ancient societies never attempted. At first glance, the rivers of the Indus region appear generous. Seasonal floods deposited fertile silt, feeding agriculture and sustaining dense populations. Yet these same floods were unpredictable and dangerous. Too much water could erase homes and crops overnight. Too little could collapse entire communities. Managing water was not optional, it was existential. Instead of reacting to water, the Indus people anticipated it. Every city reveals a layered strategy for water control. Wells were everywhere, sometimes one for every few houses, suggesting decentralized access rather than reliance on central reservoirs. This ensured that no household was entirely dependent on distant sources. But wells were only the beginning. Water had to be used, reused, and removed. Homes often included bathing areas connected to carefully sloped drains. Wastewater did not spill into the streets. It did not collect in open pits. It flowed, predictably, into covered channels that ran beneath major roads. These channels were engineered with gradients subtle enough to prevent erosion but strong enough to avoid stagnation. This balance is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of hydraulics that emerges only through observation, testing, and long-term refinement. Too steep a slope and the drains would collapse. Too shallow and water would stagnate, spreading disease. The Indus engineers found the precise middle ground. What makes this even more remarkable is that drainage systems were often built before houses. This reverses the logic of most ancient settlements, where sanitation is added later as populations grow. In the Indus Valley, drainage was foundational. The city was designed around it, not the other way around. The materials used tell their own story. Drains were lined with baked bricks, far more durable than sun-dried ones. Brick joints were sealed tightly, preventing leakage and contamination of surrounding soil. In some locations, brick covers could be lifted for cleaning, suggesting routine maintenance rather than emergency repair. Maintenance implies administration. But again, there is no sign of bureaucratic offices, royal decrees, or monumental inscriptions celebrating these achievements. The intelligence behind the system is silent. Water management extended beyond waste. Large public baths, such as the famous Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, were not ornamental structures. Their waterproof floors, controlled inlets, and drainage outlets indicate ritualized water use on a civic scale. Water here was symbolic, social, and controlled, never chaotic. Even rainwater was not left unmanaged. Roofs sloped inward toward courtyards, directing runoff into collection areas or drains rather than onto streets. Streets themselves were elevated in places, allowing excess water to flow into main channels during heavy rains. The city behaved like a living organism, adjusting to seasonal rhythms. What is perhaps most astonishing is what the system does not show. There is no evidence of massive dams, towering aqueducts, or monumental canals like those seen in Mesopotamia or Rome. Instead, control was subtle, distributed, and embedded within daily life. The system did not dominate the landscape, it blended into it. This approach suggests a different philosophy of engineering. Rather than imposing power over nature, the Indus people designed systems that worked with it. They accepted variability and built flexibility into their cities. Redundancy replaced centralization. Quiet efficiency replaced spectacle. Such sophistication forces us to reconsider how we define advanced civilization. Technological progress is often measured by scale and visibility. Yet the Indus Valley demonstrates that the most advanced systems are sometimes the least visible, the ones that work so well they fade into the background. And still, one question remains unresolved. If these systems were so effective, so resilient, why did they eventually fall out of use? Why were cities abandoned, drains left unmaintained, and urban order slowly dissolved? The answer does not lie in a single disaster. It lies in the delicate balance between environment, society, and infrastructure, a balance that can shift gradually, invisibly, until even the most intelligent systems can no longer adapt. To uncover that turning point, we must step away from the drains and look outward, toward climate, rivers, and the slow forces that reshape civilizations over centuries. Civilizations rarely collapse with noise. There is no single day when cities fall silent, no clear moment when people decide to abandon the systems that sustained them for centuries. More often, decline begins quietly, through changes so gradual that they feel survivable, until suddenly they are not. For the Indus Valley Civilization, that turning point came not from invasion or rebellion, but from the slow shifting of the world itself. The rivers that once nourished Indus cities were dynamic systems, sensitive to climate and geography. Monsoon patterns dictated agricultural success, while river courses determined where settlements could thrive. For generations, the balance held. Floods were manageable. Water was predictable. Cities flourished. Then the rhythm began to change. Paleoclimate evidence suggests that monsoon cycles weakened over time. Rainfall became less reliable, arriving later or falling in shorter, more intense bursts. Rivers that once flowed steadily began to shift, split, or retreat. Some channels dried entirely, while others flooded unpredictably. For a civilization built on precision, this instability was catastrophic. Drainage systems depended on predictable water volumes. Wells required stable groundwater levels. Brick-lined channels assumed consistent flow. When rivers changed course or rainfall patterns shifted, the delicate engineering balance was disrupted, not suddenly, but relentlessly. In some cities, drains show signs of reduced maintenance. Sediment buildup appears where once water flowed freely. Brick covers were left unrepaired. Wells were abandoned. These are not signs of technological failure, they are signs of a society stretched thin. As water became scarce in some regions and excessive in others, populations began to move. Smaller settlements appeared further east, away from unstable river systems. Urban centers shrank. Streets narrowed. Houses were subdivided. The grand civic planning of earlier centuries slowly gave way to survival-driven adaptations. What is striking is that the sanitation systems did not disappear immediately. They lingered, patched, altered, simplified, until they no longer made sense in a changed environment. The system was too precise for a world that had become unpredictable. This tells us something profound. The Indus Valley did not fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it was too finely tuned to a specific environmental reality. When that reality shifted, the system could not scale down gracefully. What once made it resilient now made it fragile. Unlike Mesopotamia, where centralized authority could force massive irrigation projects, the Indus model relied on consistency and cooperation. When environmental pressures increased, there was no visible mechanism to enforce large-scale adaptation. Decentralization, once a strength, became a limitation. Yet there is no evidence of panic. Cities were not destroyed. They were not burned. People did not vanish overnight. Instead, they adapted by leaving. Skills were carried forward. Techniques survived in rural forms. The knowledge did not disappear, it transformed. Drainage systems were simplified or abandoned as populations thinned. The need for complex urban sanitation diminished. Smaller communities no longer required citywide coordination. What had once been a masterpiece of urban design became unnecessary. And so, the world's most advanced ancient sanitation system faded, not in failure, but in irrelevance. This slow unraveling challenges our obsession with collapsed narratives. The Indus Valley did not fall, it transitioned. Its people did not lose their intelligence, they adjusted to a new environmental reality. But this raises an even deeper question. If the Indus Valley possessed such advanced engineering, social discipline, and environmental awareness, why did later civilizations fail to inherit this knowledge? Why were these systems not replicated or improved upon for thousands of years? The answer lies not only in climate, but in memory, in what civilizations choose to record, preserve, and pass forward. And that is where the mystery deepens. History is not a record of everything that happened. It is a record of what survived. The greatest tragedy of the Indus Valley Civilization is not its decline, it is its disappearance from memory. For nearly 2,000 years, its cities lay buried beneath river silt and shifting sands, while later civilizations rose without knowing what had come before. The question is not why Indus engineering vanished, but why it was never remembered. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus people left no monumental inscriptions celebrating kings, victories, or divine mandates. There are no carved chronicles describing how cities were built, how water was managed, or how sanitation was organized. Their writing, still undeciphered, appears briefly on seals and tablets, but never in long explanatory texts. Without narrative, knowledge became invisible. Civilizations that dominate history are often those that tell stories about themselves. Pharaohs carved their achievements in stone. Mesopotamian rulers inscribed laws and conquests. Greek and Roman authors documented systems for posterity. The Indus Valley, by contrast, seems to have prioritized function over self-promotion. Their genius worked silently. When cities were abandoned, there were no scrolls explaining how drains were engineered or why wells were placed where they were. The systems existed only as lived infrastructure. Once the cities emptied, the knowledge had no voice. Time completed the erasure. Flooding rivers buried streets and houses layer by layer. Bricks were scavenged by later settlers. Urban grids dissolved into farmland. By the time historical civilizations emerged in South Asia, the physical evidence of Indus engineering was fragmented and unrecognizable. And because later societies developed different priorities, the absence of complex sanitation did not raise alarms. Cities grew organically, adapting to new social and political structures rather than reviving ancient blueprints. Colonial-era archaeology nearly missed it altogether. When British engineers in the 19th century encountered strange baked bricks while building railways, they reused them, unaware they were dismantling one of the world's earliest urban systems. Entire sections of Indus cities were destroyed before their significance was understood. Even when Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were finally excavated in the 20th century, scholars struggled to interpret what they saw. There were no palaces, no temples dominating the skyline, no obvious symbols of authority. The civilization didn't match known historical models. So it was underestimated. For decades, the Indus Valley was described as primitive, peaceful, or less advanced simply because it lacked familiar markers of power. Its sanitation systems were treated as curiosities rather than central achievements. This reveals a deeper bias in how we define progress. History often equates advancement with conquest, hierarchy, and monumentality. The Indus Valley prioritized health, order, and communal infrastructure, values that leave fewer dramatic artifacts. Their cities were not built to impress outsiders, they were built to function for everyone. And that made them forgettable, until modern science caught up. Only with contemporary urban studies, public health research, and environmental archaeology did scholars begin to realize what had been lost. Suddenly, the brick-lined drains, standardized slopes, and private sanitation systems looked astonishingly modern. The Indus Valley had solved problems that plague cities today: waste management, water safety, and urban hygiene, without centralized coercion or visible elites. Yet this recognition arrived thousands of years too late. By the time the world understood what Indus engineers had achieved, the continuity of that knowledge was broken. No apprentices remained. No institutions preserved the techniques. The civilization had optimized itself for its time, but not for historical survival. This leads to an uncomfortable realization. The Indus Valley did not fail to teach the future. The future failed to recognize its teachers. And as we face our own urban and environmental challenges, the forgotten lessons of the Indus Valley become more than historical curiosities, they become warnings. Because if a civilization can master sanitation, sustainability, and social order, and still vanish from memory, what does that say about how we measure success? The answer may lie in the very systems we choose to celebrate. Modern cities like to believe they represent the peak of human progress. Skyscrapers pierce the clouds, highways stretch across continents, and technology promises solutions to every problem. Yet beneath this confidence lies an uncomfortable truth. Many of today's cities struggle with issues the Indus Valley solved over 4,000 years ago. Water contamination, flooding, sanitation failures, urban inequality. These are not new problems. They are ancient ones, and the Indus Valley approached them with a level of foresight that modern planning often ignores. The most striking difference lies in how Indus cities treated infrastructure. Sanitation was not an afterthought added once wealth accumulated, it was foundational. Streets, homes, drains, and wells were designed together as a single system. Every brick served a purpose within a broader urban logic. Modern cities, by contrast, are frequently built in fragments. Residential zones expand without sufficient sewage planning. Informal settlements emerge faster than infrastructure can support them. Even in wealthy nations, aging drainage systems buckle under population pressure and climate stress. The Indus Valley avoided this by design. Their engineers assumed growth, planned for runoff, and built redundancy into systems. Covered drains were not decorative, they protected public health by limiting exposure. Access points allowed maintenance. Sloped channels ensured constant flow without reliance on mechanical force. No electricity. No pumps. No bureaucracy. Just physics, foresight, and discipline. Perhaps the most radical lesson is how sanitation was democratized. In Indus cities, waste management was not restricted to elite districts. Even modest homes had access to drains, baths, and clean water. This suggests a worldview in which public health was collective, not hierarchical. Modern cities often reverse this logic. Sanitation quality correlates strongly with wealth, leaving marginalized populations exposed to disease and environmental risk. The Indus model challenges this imbalance, not through ideology, but through evidence. Another overlooked insight is sustainability. Indus drainage systems relied on gravity, durable materials, and local resources. They required minimal energy input and produced systems that lasted centuries. In an age obsessed with high-tech solutions, this simplicity feels almost radical. Today's infrastructure frequently prioritizes speed and cost over longevity. Materials degrade quickly. Maintenance is deferred. Systems fail dramatically rather than aging gracefully. The Indus Valley built for endurance. There is also a lesson in restraint. Indus cities show little evidence of monumental excess. Resources were invested in systems that benefited daily life rather than symbolic dominance. Their streets are wide but not extravagant. Their buildings are standardized, not grandiose. This suggests a civic philosophy focused on functionality rather than spectacle. Modern urban planning often chases visual impact, iconic skylines, signature architecture, while neglecting invisible systems like drainage and waste management. Yet it is these unseen systems that determine whether a city thrives or collapses under its own complexity. Perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson is social. The Indus Valley achieved remarkable engineering feats without obvious signs of centralized authoritarian control. There are no palaces towering over cities, no inscriptions glorifying rulers. This implies coordination without coercion, a society organized around shared standards rather than imposed commands. Modern governance struggles with this balance. Infrastructure becomes politicized. Long-term planning loses to short-term gains. Collective benefit is sacrificed to individual interest. The Indus Valley reminds us that effective systems do not require loud leadership, they require shared commitment. As climate change intensifies rainfall, sea levels rise, and urban populations swell, the ancient solutions of the Indus Valley feel less like relics and more like blueprints. Their cities were resilient because they respected natural forces instead of fighting them. Gravity flowed where it was needed. Water drained where it should. Waste was removed quietly, efficiently, and continuously. No system is perfect. The Indus Valley eventually declined, shaped by environmental shifts beyond human control. But its urban logic remains astonishingly relevant. The question is not whether modern cities can learn from the Indus Valley. It is whether they are willing to. Because the greatest engineering lesson left by this ancient civilization is not hidden in bricks or drains, it is embedded in priorities. When a society chooses health, order, and sustainability over spectacle and power, it builds something far more enduring than monuments. It builds a civilization that works. And that may be the most revolutionary idea of all. Every great system has designers. Every city has minds that shaped it. Yet in the Indus Valley, the architects of one of the most advanced urban networks in human history remain invisible. There are no statues of master builders. No inscriptions naming chief engineers. No legends celebrating visionary planners. The people who designed the drains, aligned the streets, and standardized the bricks left no signatures behind. This absence is not accidental. It reflects a civilization fundamentally different from those that came after it. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, engineering was an extension of royal power. Projects were centralized, monumental, and deeply symbolic. Structures announced authority. Names were carved so rulers would be remembered. In the Indus Valley, engineering served life itself, not rulers, gods, or conquest. The system mattered more than the individual. Archaeological evidence suggests that Indus cities followed shared planning principles across vast distances. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, and other urban centers exhibit remarkable consistency in brick ratios, street layouts, and drainage designs. This implies a standardized body of technical knowledge passed between generations. But how was this knowledge transmitted? Without deciphered texts, historians turn to the cities themselves. The precision of construction suggests formal training. The repetition of design indicates learned practices rather than improvisation. Someone taught others how to measure slopes, how to lay bricks, how to channel water. These were not isolated geniuses. They were communities of skilled practitioners. The absence of elite housing near administrative centers also suggests something radical. Engineering expertise may not have been restricted to a ruling class. Instead of being controlled by kings, technical knowledge appears to have been shared, institutionalized, and embedded in everyday construction. In other words, Indus engineering was cultural, not personal. This explains why innovation did not rely on individual fame. The goal was not to outdo predecessors, but to maintain systems that worked. Improvements were subtle, incremental, and practical. There is no evidence of reckless experimentation or symbolic excess. Everything was tested by use. The design of drainage systems reveals this mindset clearly. Drains were built to be cleaned, not admired. Inspection holes were placed where workers could access them. Brick linings were standardized so repairs could be made easily. Nothing was decorative. Everything was intentional. Such design suggests deep experience with failure. Engineers learned where systems broke and adapted accordingly. They understood monsoon patterns, waste accumulation, and material stress. This knowledge likely came from generations of observation, not abstract theory. Unlike later civilizations that relied on written treatises, the Indus Valley may have transmitted engineering knowledge through apprenticeship and practice. Skills were learned by doing, refined over time, and preserved through repetition. This makes the system resilient, but fragile to disruption. When cities were abandoned, the knowledge left with the people. Without texts or monuments to preserve techniques, engineering wisdom faded quickly. Successive cultures inherited the land, but not the systems. This is why the Indus Valley feels like a technological anomaly. It appears suddenly in archaeological records with advanced planning already in place, then disappears just as quietly. The silence surrounding its engineers is not due to absence of skill, but absence of ego. And this challenges modern assumptions about innovation. We often imagine progress as driven by brilliant individuals. The Indus Valley suggests the opposite. Progress can emerge from collective discipline, shared standards, and anonymous expertise. No genius architect needed to be remembered for the city to function. In fact, remembering individuals may not have mattered at all. The true legacy of Indus engineers lies not in names, but in systems that endured for centuries. Their work supported millions of lives without demanding recognition. This raises a powerful question. What kind of society values function over fame? Stability over spectacle? Collective well-being over individual glory? The Indus Valley did. And in doing so, it produced one of the most quietly sophisticated civilizations the world has ever known. But silence has a cost. Because when no one claims credit, history often forgets who to thank. No system, no matter how refined, exists outside the forces of nature and time. The Indus Valley Civilization was engineered for stability, but not for eternity. For centuries, its cities functioned with remarkable consistency. Drainage flowed, streets remained orderly, and sanitation systems continued to serve growing populations. But beneath this surface of control, slow changes were unfolding, changes that engineering alone could not prevent. The rivers that once sustained the civilization began to behave differently. The Indus and its tributaries were lifelines, providing water, fertile soil, and transportation. Yet geological evidence suggests shifts in river courses, reduced monsoon reliability, and increased flooding in certain regions. Cities designed for predictable water flow suddenly faced extremes, too much water at once, or too little over time. Drainage systems that had worked flawlessly under stable conditions were now pushed to their limits. Silt accumulation increased as floods deposited heavier sediments. Channels clogged more frequently. Maintenance, once manageable, became constant. Even well-designed systems struggle when environmental rhythms change faster than societies can adapt. At the same time, urban density may have intensified pressure on infrastructure. As populations grew, waste volumes increased. Drains designed for earlier scales of habitation faced heavier loads. The system did not collapse, but it strained. Archaeological layers tell this story quietly. Later construction phases show narrower streets, altered drainage paths, and less consistent brick quality. Repairs become more frequent but less precise. Standardization begins to weaken, not because knowledge vanished, but because conditions demanded rapid adaptation. This is not decay. It is improvisation. The Indus Valley did not fall apart suddenly. It adjusted. Houses were rebuilt. Drains were rerouted. Wells were added or abandoned. The cities were responding to a world becoming less predictable. Yet adaptation has limits. As rivers shifted further and agricultural patterns changed, maintaining large urban populations became increasingly difficult. Food security weakened. Trade routes altered. The tightly integrated system that once supported dense cities began to fragment. Importantly, there is little evidence of violent destruction. No burned layers. No mass graves. No signs of conquest. The engineering did not fail catastrophically, it was gradually outpaced by environmental transformation. People did what humans have always done in such moments. They moved. Cities thinned out. Urban centers lost population. Smaller settlements emerged closer to reliable water sources. The grand drainage systems, once essential, became unnecessary, or impossible to maintain. When people left, maintenance stopped. And when maintenance stopped, even the best designed systems fell silent. This is the cruel truth of infrastructure: it survives only as long as society sustains it. The Indus Valley's engineering brilliance did not disappear because it was flawed. It disappeared because the ecological and social context that sustained it changed. This distinction matters. Too often, collapse is framed as failure. But the Indus story is one of transformation. A civilization adapted, decentralized, and reshaped itself in response to forces beyond engineering control. Yet in doing so, it lost the very systems that made it exceptional. As cities dissolved into memory, their drains filled with sediment, their streets vanished beneath fields, and their knowledge faded with each generation that no longer lived among brick-lined channels and covered sewers. What remained was silence, until excavation centuries later revealed the truth. The Indus Valley did not fall because it lacked intelligence. It fell because intelligence alone cannot command rivers, climate, and time. And that lesson, perhaps more than any drain or brick, is the most enduring engineering insight of all.